In this episode of Suspect Zero, the case of the Millennium Strangler.
Welcome to Suspect Zero, where we not only discuss unsolved cold cases, but serial killers whose crimes are lesser known or virtually unknown, yet the most terrifying. I'm Dawn Washburn, and joining me is my co-host, Dr. Michael Arntfield. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Don. So I believe this is already, our 7th or 8th episode, I think, by this point.
I know, it's crazy. I can't even believe we're still in it. I thought I was just gonna, not be able to come up with any more material and I was gonna flop, but I think we're doing okay.
This is what you have me for, an endless sort of array of unheard of cases. And this week is one that by the time this is airing or being downloaded, we'll hopefully have seen some significant development, because as we're meeting here today, there's already been some new developments, and there's a major TV production underway right now that's going to really shed a light on these cases.
Well, I can't wait to get into it then. So, you know how I always do my openings, and I love these because it kind of ties us together and it gets my mind thinking. And this is how I also, present it to my students when I teach after we talk about it. So when a predator is hunting for their prey, they plan, observe, stalk, and if the opportunity arises, they attack. At times, their prey may even walk into the doorway to the predator's lair without even realizing what's about to happen. This makes for an easy kill, especially for a serial killer who is aware that there are certain types of prey that are susceptible targets due to their risky occupations. The predator knows they more than likely will not be searched for or cared about. These women who live unfortunate lives by making money to support some of their children, their homelessness, or even their drug habits have been deemed society's trash and dismissed as a human being. Serial killers have been targeting sex workers since the 19th century, when Jack the Ripper stalked the London streets for his prey. The secret deviant acts in the night, the anxious strangers, the salacious danger, all add to the reason police find difficulty in locating these dark shadows. So in essence, these women seem to be the most logical of prey. The setting is Southwest Chicago, which is often identified in the second half of the 20th century with most of the city's African-American population. Chicago can also be associated with the Chicago White Sox, Wrigley Field, and the Magnificent Mile. But as in any city, we shouldn't be deceived by what is lurking behind these infamous landmarks. So between 2001 and present day, at least 55 women and girls in southwestern Chicago were found raped and strangled. Some were set on fire and thrown in dumpsters. Who is behind all of these murders? Chicago police have arrested Arthur Hilliard and charged him with the homicide of one victim, Diamond Turner. And this was the first arrest to be made among a large cluster of female strangulations on Chicago's south and west sides. When 19-year-old Africa Hardy was found strangled in a Motel 6 in Indiana, authorities used Hardy's phone records and located another suspect, Darren Dion Van, who upon apprehension was found to have possession of several key pieces of potential evidence, which included the victim's phone. There's still a question mark as to whether or not there's a third serial killer involved in these gruesome crimes, and this will be the cold case we will be discussing today. With many dead ends in sight, police were guided in the right direction when the Murder Accountability Project's algorithm projected that a serial killer or killers were possibly responsible. The Murder Accountability Project was organized in 2015, and its goal is to gather information from various law agencies in order to help solve cold cases. Their dedication to solving cold cases is not only admirable, but crucial in solving these cases for victims and their families. So, Michael, you are a director on the Murder Accountability Project. How are there 51 murders that are somewhat connected, but basically have no reporting?
Well, that's a good question. And what I've never really understood is our algorithm identified, using a number of sort of search characteristics and looking for a certain set of common characteristics, linked these 55, and we've actually narrowed it down to 51 since 2001 strangulation murders of women in South Chicago. And I understand that, we were the first to sort of have this magic eye puzzle come together, because, you're talking about a city. Let's be realistic. Last weekend had over 40 shootings. That, crime is at a historic, violent crime, specifically murders, at a historic high in the U.S. right now, and certain cities are seeing that we're already sort of dancing on a precipice of extreme catastrophe in terms of crime waves are seeing it go up even further. So Chicago is one of those. And it's amid all this violence, amid this mayhem, it seems as though over the last 20 years, these single strangulation murders have sort of just been paved over by this avalanche of other murders. But what boggles my mind is, I understand how the police can't necessarily see the forest through the trees, or if you got 51 over 20 years versus 40 shootings a weekend. But given how these crime scenes are relatively clustered in space, I mean, where are the local community people, the shopkeepers, even the cops on a beat who say, who aren't saying, this is now the 5th, 6th, 36th, 45th. Like, at what point did somebody start saying, hey, what the hell's going on here with respect to, specifically when you look at the modus operandi? I mean, we can basically bifurcate or divide the victims into two distinct sets. Young Latino or Latina, Latinx females who were found naked outdoors in most circumstances, left as is wherever they were attacked, which is a certain set of offender characteristics. And then African-American women of varying ages who in many cases, as you mentioned, were actually set on fire. And what's interesting, terrifying actually, is that we're seeing this pattern now reappear after something of a hiatus, since there's been now some finally overdue media attention on this. We're seeing this same pattern emerge in communities to the south of the city, as though, and this is significant, we can talk more about this later, but another pattern within this pattern is that they seem to follow the green line, which is the track of the L train, the public transportation system in Chicago. So is it possible that the killer is now has set his sights beyond the city and he just keeps pushing further and further south? I mean, when we're seeing strangulation murders and the use of fire, which again, in combination, very rare, and stranger attacks in now communities outside the city, we have to consider the possibility that one of the two that we suspect serial killers has now ventured beyond the city limits. And I mean, over a 20-year period, are these all the work of one killer? Well, we already know that. We know Hilliard is responsible for at least one. He's suspected in some others. We know that Darren Dion Van lived in Chicago in the early 2000s at a time corresponding with a number of these murders, and the MO matches his MO that he later used in Gary, Indiana, where he was eventually arrested in Hammond, Indiana, which is a neighboring community of Gary. But he's been in jail for some time, so we know the most recent ones aren't him. And we see, again, these two different MOs between the Latina or Hispanic victims and the African-American victims. But the fact that these began in 2001, as best we can tell, is why I and others have assigned the name to one or more of these suspects as the Millennium Strangler. Turn of the millennium, these two or more killers just for whatever reason began offending in this manner. And it's Millennium Stranglers, plural, let's face it, but that's the name we're working with right now.
Wow. I mean, I was sitting and thinking about how, the algorithm just, surface. Like, what do you sit down and you decide, like, there's just too much going on. We have to figure out why this is not being recognized. Is that how the algorithm came about? Because I'm so interested in how you just sit down and one day decide, I'm going to make an algorithm that's going to help find clusters of serial killers. Like, it's genius. But you think about it and like, how do you sit down and do this? What comes about that you essentially make a serial killer detector, So that's essentially what it looks like.
Yeah, there was an article in the New Yorker on our work that was the title of the article, The Serial Killer Detector. And very quickly, what it is one of the co-founders of MAP, Eric Witzig, who was a retired FBI agent and a retired Metro DC homicide detective as well. He spent almost 50 years in law enforcement, over 50 years, in fact, and he's now deceased. And his contributions, I mean, were invaluable. And basically, he spent much of his career at the FBI working on the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, which is this digital nationwide dragnet that relies on data provided on murders provided by police agencies and looks for commonalities across, different cities, state lines, coast to coast. The thought is, if you see something really weird in terms of offender behavior in one city and it shows up a month later in another city, you may be dealing with a mobile serial killer, or if you see them in the same city for that matter. The problem I can get to that. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll just quickly explain. The problem with VICAP is that it was a voluntary program. It's a lot of work filling out these questionnaires and sending them off. So what we did was we used a simplified version. We pulled all the data from every law enforcement agency using open records legislation in the U.S., and we built our own. We built our own that could learn, that would look at not hundreds of characteristics, but at 6 or 7 key characteristics that would allow us to, and allow users. I mean, listeners and watchers can go to murderdata.org and play around with it and look for patterns using our various search criteria. But the algorithm automatically looks for strangulations, which we know is a preferred methodology among serial killers who had the vast majority of their crimes involve some form of strangulation, whether or not the cause of death or just contributing cause of death. So it looks at every 24 hours at a set of certain criteria, and it finds these suspicious clusters that have eluded either VICAP and or the detectives working the cases. In part because we're looking at crimes occurring over years or decades. I mean, the algorithm is pulling data going back to the 70s. So that's several police careers where that information isn't necessarily getting handed down from one detective to another, or even, as we see in Chicago, they weren't even aware of the pattern. So you asked, are they receptive? And yes and no. In Cleveland, we found a pattern, alerted authorities. They were immediately on it, formed a task force, and there was an arrest made. Again, we believe there's probably 2 killers in that case, but we're confident we got one of them. To go back to Darren Dion Van, it's interesting. Our first case was this cluster in Gary, Indiana. And we notified the Gary PD. They were dismissive of it. And it wasn't until Van is arrested in neighboring Hammond, Indiana, and confesses to the crimes back in Gary that we realized our computer was right. And people didn't want to listen. And I'm confident, at the very least, the woman murdered in Hammond would be alive if the Gary police had listened and looked at what was going on in their own backyard. And it took them committing a murder in a neighboring community where some excellent, to be honest, police work was done and he was arrested. It took that for the pieces to fall into place and for that to become our proof of concept. So the new chief of detectives in Chicago is receptive. There is an FBI Chicago PD Joint Task Force on these cases. And like I said, the progress is being made now that is going to be showcased in that Chicago Strangler series that's forthcoming on ID.
The Chicago Millennium Strangler is the nickname given to the American serial killer or killers suspected of raping and murdering at least 55 women and girls in southwestern Chicago between 2001 and 2021. Chicago police have arrested Arthur Hilliard and charged him with the homicide of Diamond Turner, the first arrest to be made among a larger cluster of 51 female strangulations on Chicago's south and west sides. The cluster was identified by a computer algorithm developed by the Murder Accountability Project, whose members include my co-host, Dr. Mike Larkfield. Hilliard, 52, is also under investigation for 2 other homicides, according to police. He was previously charged and convicted of the illegal concealment of the body of murder victim Andrea Williams, who was confined to a wheelchair. Williams' body was found with multiple stab wounds in a shopping cart in the alley behind his West Side apartment building. The other 50 victims, who were predominantly African-American and Hispanic women and teens between the ages of 18 and 58, were strangled and left in abandoned buildings, alleys, garbage bins, parks, and snowdrifts. There is much speculation about there being 3 separate serial killers who have been operating in Chicago since at least 2001. The cases dropped off in 2014 suggested that the killer might have been in jail at that time. Then the pattern started again in March of 2017 and is now extended into the city's outer suburbs to the south, suggesting that at least one of the killers is now expanding his territory. The more I was reading about the case and the more I was thinking about it, all these questions came up, but it was a lot of investigative questions because when I teach my students, those are the questions that come up. What do they do first? You want to figure out a crime. What's the first thing you do? Interview the witnesses. What's the most important? Because everything is so subjective. We talked about this in another podcast. It's so the way people think and their perspectives and how they look at a crime scene. We talked about that with the Jeanette Tapama case. You're looking at these, everybody's viewing it so differently. But in a simplistic form, I look at the Chicago strangulations and I just think to myself, how could they not see it's a serial killer? How do you even, this is happening so frequently and we do, and you said something that struck a chord. So the strangulation with the serial killers is so common because they love to feel as if they're godlike, that they have control of that life. A gun is not going to really fulfill that pleasure or that desire when they kill so quickly. So the strangulation is, the long, prolonged watching someone die. So again, in a large series of these, I mean, Cottingham was clearly killing a lot of prostitutes because they were easy targets. So this just seems like it follows that same pattern. So even without the algorithm, did they even suspect that it could have been a serial killer?
There's no evidence to that. In fact, prior to the current chief of detectives being appointed, the previous chief of detectives publicly said, once city councilors caught wind of our work and started asking, these are their wards, and they're saying, what the hell's going on? And they publicly said there was no active serial killer in the city of Chicago, which, this pattern aside, I'm not sure how anyone could, with a straight face, say that or be willing to say that, and with any degree of confidence. It's rather unfortunate. It's the same situation as occurred in Gary. The denial, because let's face it, there is no real greater indictment of municipal leadership than to have a serial killer on the loose. They are a microcosm of essentially a broken down infrastructure, broken down social system, broken down social safety nets, broken down police departments, broken down everything, so that they're allowed to operate and claim 2-3 victims, much less 51 victims. So of course they're going to say that until proven otherwise. And we're in the midst of obviously furnishing that proof. So how did they not know? Again, these victims are sprinkled in 1 or 2 a year in a city that has hundreds of murders a year, a lot of movement internally, whereby, and we recognize this as a contributing factor in cold cases, continuous sort of revolving door detectives coming in, coming out. No one really is up to speed on the case enough to see the pattern by the time they've moved on or they're reassigned something else. It is not the surgical fine-tuned process like you see on TV. It is an often chaotic fly by the seat of your pants, especially in cities clocking these numbers in terms of homicides annually.
And I also think people don't, it's quick. People are quick to judge, but you really don't understand the influx of cases that these departments get. So you have to decide which case, you could solve and which case is not going to be. I mean, it must be a very daunting task. Even when you hear about how many murders happen in a given area that may not even be connected to that. So now you not only have the 55 women being strangled in that, but you have gang related things, you have other things going on that have to be looked at too. So I can only imagine how overwhelming that could be. So having the Murder Accountability Project's algorithm, I would say would be a very crucial tool for them, to even help identify, just to narrow it down. Because I like I said, I can't even figure out where I would go to first to even solve a crime like that. There's so many things you need to do,
Well, and we know now law enforcement is using our algorithm to check out hunches that they have. So, for instance, a detective in Louisiana has a weird case with some weird signatures and offender behaviors. I mean, you can't, again, we're not as thorough as VICAP, which has hundreds of points of comparison. But, I mean, if it's weird enough just based on a speculated motive or what was done to the body, in a matter of minutes, that investigator can search the details of their case against other similar cases all over the country. It's because if this killer just shows up in town, the thought is, well, where was he before, and where is he offended before in a similar fashion? I mean, you can look up, and this is really disturbing. We have a criteria. So the algorithm doesn't automatically search for this, but users can go to the site and tinker with it and look for prevalence of murders according to certain motives. You want to know how many people have been drowned over drug deals in Pennsylvania, you can look for that, and you can get all the case details or basic case details. But there's actually a category for cold cases where children were murdered by babysitters, meaning that the babysitter, I mean, if it's unsolved, is not who you thought they were. And there's more of those than you'd think. The algorithm, just to quickly go back to that, Don, for a second, is you talked about strangulations. It is premised on a very simple rule of offender behavior, basically, and what we know about what types of cases get solved. The vast majority of females are murdered by intimate partners, as in cases of domestic violence. Some of those are strangulations, some involve other weapons. But when you see more than 2 unsolved strangulations in a single census metropolitan area, so in a city, that go unsolved, that means that, and by unsolved, I mean we look for crimes that have no suspect identified. So these are not cases where they have a viable suspect and they just don't have enough to arrest yet. When you have 2 or more in a single city that are unsolved and involve strangulation, that suggests stranger on stranger. And those are so statistically rare that you have to operate under the informed assumption that those are connected and you have a serial killer until proven otherwise. So that's 2, which is the definition that we work with of a serial killer. How about 52? How about, again, when you get into these kinds of numbers, it's indefensible to say you do not have a serial killer problem.
I agree. I mean, and I'm a novice. I don't even know the first thing about, I'm just a true crime teacher. And immediately that's the first thing. I'm like, well, what, we're looking for, well, at the time I thought we were looking for one person, because I'm thinking, they're getting away with it. Why wouldn't they keep doing it in the same area? They're not even being looked for. Well, I shouldn't say they're not even being looked for, but they're, at the time they didn't know what they're looking for.
That's right. That's right.
So, I mean, and then, go ahead.
So, yeah, when you say more than one, again, we know we're confident that the killer of Diamond Turner or the alleged killer, let's be clear on that at this point, who is suspected in some others, that would represent 1. I believe, and some homicide scholar colleagues of mine agree, that we can probably divide the Hispanic victims from the African-American victims. There's just the age ranges are too varied. The MOs are too different. So that brings us up to 3. And then we have to seriously consider the role or the possibility that Darren Dion Van was involved in some of the early ones where they were found in abandoned buildings, which is exactly the MO that he repeated later in Gary, Indiana.
It would seem likely. And then another thing I wanted to raise today, because this was something else that I was teaching my students, and I was trying to make some sort of analogy for them to understand this. But could you talk about, because I think our listeners will be very interested in this, could you talk about clearance rates?
Okay. So this is our most technical episode yet, obviously.
Yes, it really is. It really is.
So we may have lost some people by this point, but certainly if you have an interest in forensics or law enforcement techniques or what's actually going on behind the scenes, I talk about all this in detail in my book that's coming out next year, How to Solve a Cold Case, the secrets that the killers and the police don't want you to know. So clearance rates. The clearance rate, the national clearance rate. So there's a national clearance rate that basically is how many murders a year get solved in the United States. So clearance means a case is resolved or closed. And it can be cleared by a charge if someone's arrested and charged. Doesn't matter if they're acquitted or convicted. That case is closed from the standpoint of the police reporting to the U.S. Justice Department. Okay, what happens down the road, it's been resolved on the police end. That's all that matters for that purpose. It can be cleared by other means or exceptional means, meaning the killer takes his own life. Killer, by the time they're identified in a cold case, for instance, is already deceased. Well, you don't just leave that open. The case is resolved either by DNA or by some other means, so you can clear it to that person, even if they haven't been arrested and there's not going to be a trial or what have you. And there's a few other exceptional means that allow for cases to be cleared other than by charge. So this is the way that we gauge success of homicide investigation. So there's a national clearance rate, which is the aggregated data from every police department all over the U.S. And then there's obviously local clearance rates. And that's another thing that you can do at murderaccountability.org or murderdata.org is search your own city. How many cases are resolved a year in your city? If you were murdered, what are your chances of your killer being caught or being identified? Because really the clearance rate just, again, like I said, doesn't necessarily mean caught. They could be dead as well, or already serving time and what have you. So they're not going to be rearrested because they're already serving life or on death row, and so they're cleared by other means. So for years, so there's the good, the bad, the ugly. Some cities are really good, some are not so good, and some are just, it's quite frankly dangerous to be living there. And because, let's face it, for every unresolved murder, you have an unidentified suspect walking around free to kill again. So from really the 1930s until 2016, the clearance rate in the U.S. had always been relatively stable around 70%, meaning on average, nationally, 7 out of 10 homicides are resolved or cleared. 2016 dropped down to about 50%. And there's a few explanations why. And in part because some cities got really, really ineffective and dragged down the whole national average. There's also the thought that 3 factors changed sort of shortly after the 21st century in terms of murder. The nature of homicides, the nature of homicide investigators and investigations, and specifically the nature of bystander behavior. The thought being that fewer and fewer people are cooperating with investigations, are trusting of law enforcement, especially in some cities, whereby eliciting witness or even victim cooperation in other violent crimes just means these cases go nowhere. And so when you add all this up, we're left with a major problem now that, homicide rate in the U.S. is at a 50-year high. So you've got a soaring homicide rate in some cities like Chicago, and you have a diminishing or declining clearance rate. So this does not bode well for, you can imagine the backlog of cold cases after just a few years of this pattern. So does that explain it?
It explains it. It explains it.
Okay.
I think I kept telling my students, because how I'm not technical. I have to, like, when I hear you tell me stuff, then I play off of that, and then I bring it to my classroom, and I sound like I'm really intelligent when I repeat this stuff. But for what I did tell them was, I said, how we have to have like a graduation rate, like we lose funding if we don't, everybody doesn't graduate at the, at a certain rate, we could lose funding. So they have to have a certain reporting of that.
That's
so
right.
that we can keep our funding. And that's how I kind of likened it to a clearance rate, because I had to read it like 14 times before I really understood what it was.
Sorry to interject, but the difference though being, aside from embarrassment, I suppose, or bad publicity, there is no funding tied to clearance rates. So you could have a terrible clearance rate, like some cities do, and it doesn't affect your bottom line. So, this is where we run into the problem of, mismanagement and misfeasance and even malfeasance among senior police administrators is, if what's in it for them? Why would I authorize overtime? Why would I increase the number of vehicles in the motor pool so detectives could get to scenes more quickly, which we know is a key variable in terms of clearing cases quickly. So yeah, no, I can reallocate that money for something else. And the bottom line is law enforcement agencies that invest the proper resources in investigating murders, and it doesn't matter who the victim is, high profile child murder or the cases of the women murdered in Chicago by the Millennium Stranglers, who, as you said, are sort of just dismissed as being on the margins and the detritus of society. It doesn't matter. Every victim, every case is investigated consistently and thoroughly, and the money and resources are allocated for that. Otherwise, you get the problem that we're seeing now, which is, in some cities, 30%, 40%. I mean, in what other profession is that kind of performance acceptable?
There's no really checks and balances on whether or not, how to solve a crime, So again, another very subjective way to look at it, because you don't have anyone saying like, well, and I come back to this case because this is one that we did in my class, which I could kind of, so we did the Adnan Syed case in our class, and the students were really just blown away by the fact that no one was checking up on anyone to figure out if the investigation was being unraveled the way that it should have been unraveled. So an episode like this, although might seem technical, it's important. Not everything is a narrative. Not everything is a
That's right.
story for everyone. It really isn't. And I think this is, again, and I say this in almost every one of our podcasts, it's very important for the public to have this awareness be raised, not just the story behind people are addicted to that story, but you have to know what's going on behind the scenes to make that story what it is. And when things start making logical sense and things start piecing together the way that they should, I guarantee a lot of the people who have already been convicted of these crimes may not even be the killer of the crime. So when you talk about clearance rates, that's something, yes, technical, but also very important to know. And also when the Murder Accountability Project was amazing. I mean, I remember stumbling on that before I even met you. I stumbled on that and brought it to my class. And I remember telling like, is anybody really good in math and data? So I had my students who were really good in math and data looking at that for me and then teaching me what it was really about, how to look at it and how to find the clusters. And then once they did that, I said, all right, now it makes sense. Now I can bring it to them in a more, in a better way. And they appreciated it. And it's just a great tool to have, a great tool to look at. So I think today's episode, although not so much the narrative everybody's looking for, but definitely information that it, is a tool to have.
Well, that's why we chose the Chicago case, because this is one that really exemplifies the work that we're doing and the importance of the algorithm and the importance of tracking murder. I mean, we have almost 1 million murders in the database that are constantly being examined by detectives, by homicide researchers, by our computers. And I mean, you really hit the nail on the head when you said it's not always a narrative. We assign narratives to make sense of complex phenomena, and the more dramatic, I suppose, the better. But at least in terms of what consumers are looking for. But at the end of the day, murder is as much a mathematical equation and problem. It's a problem of accounting. And when you peel back the surface story, that's exactly what it is. These serial killers we've been talking about, these lesser known serial killers, these unsolved cases, they are all a product of a system that has not had the proper checks and balances, that has broken down and can only be fixed through other scientific methods of inquiry, not by there's no magic bullet. And that's why, I mean, again, as you said, we're doing this podcast because this is a crowded space, but there was a blind spot in terms of the ability to actually unpack the real issues for listeners, rather than, here's another story about John Wayne Gacy.
Agreed. And my students are appreciating it, to let you know. So I changed the
Likewise.
approach in which I've been teaching it too. So, they were like, oh, are we going to learn about the Night Stalker? I'm like, no, I'm going to bring somebody worse to you. And
Yeah.
they're like, worse than the Night Star, they don't. So again, they couldn't believe Israel Key. Like they're obsessed with him now because they can't believe that this could even, this could have happened, and what a versatile criminal he was. And so again, when we're looking at the Chicago Millennium case, the Chicago Strangler, these women are still victims. Even though there's 55 of them, we don't have one story to tell. We have 55
That's
stories to tell. You can't tell 55 stories, but you know what? You can acknowledge them, and this unfortunate thing that's happened to them, no matter what business they're in. This never should have happened to them. So raising awareness, again, extremely important. And Michael, always doing this podcast with you is just a great enlightening experience. And you can't make this stuff up.
no, you can't, unfortunately.
You really can't.
No. So, before you digress from all the compliments you've been giving me, let's maybe wrap up on that high note, considering the sort of somber nature of the subject matter. So, anything else you want to ask me or pick my brain about before we wrap up?
No, I asked the questions that even the students and hopefully the listeners wanted to know. I'm hoping I covered it. I'm hoping that we got it. We hit it. But
Yeah, and if not, certainly listeners can reach out on our socials and ask me to follow up or clarify there. Yeah.
right. Well, again, Michael, such a pleasure. Everyone listening, hopefully there's a takeaway today, just as our students have them in our classrooms. So you're kind of being brought to our classrooms in a sense. But
That's right.
all right. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Dawn Washburn with my co-host, Dr. Michael Arntfield. See you next time on Suspect Zero.
In the next episode of Suspect Zero, the case of Michael Scott Magliolo.